You're tuned in to Poets Have Something to Say, and what a great honor it is. A great honor to have Nandi Comer with us. She's the Michigan State Poet Laureate. A little bit about Nandi before she introduces herself, and we're going to have her read one of her poems right off the bat. I was fascinated with her watching some interviews on YouTube and how sharp this person is. So let's introduce her by saying she's the author of The American Family, a Syndrome, also the recipient of the 2020 Society of Midland Authors Award, the 2020 Julie Suk Award, Kavi Khanum Fellow, also the 2019 Kresge Arts in Detroit Fellow, and to top it off, and I'm sure there's more, the co-director of Detroit Lit. So it's a great opportunity to delve into Nandi's poetic journey, her creative process, and how impactful her work is. And welcome to the October show of Poets Have Something to Say. Thanks, Nandi, for spending some time with us today. We appreciate you.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
All right. So, as I love to do, I'd love to start with a poem. So, if you could share a poem with us, that would be great.
Sure, I'd love to. I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the poem. I've been thinking a lot about women and their development and how we move through these moments in our life, particularly as it relates to our bodies. And so I've been writing abecedarian poems, and they're based on the various bra sizing systems that are around the world. So instead of ABC, the abecedarian is based on, at one point there's a double D and an E and an L, and it only goes to U for this one.
Okay, very creative.
Okay, the title is Bra Cup Abecedarian. It starts with a quote from Drake, the rapper. Mm-hmm. 38L, how many letters are there? One American size chart. Double A's and cursed. I was not an early bloomer. Angular elbows and knees. I was 12 when boys at church noticed them. Then I was a small cup girl, itty bitty titty committee queen. I wished for D cups, a Baywatch bod. Instead, I slipped into trainers while Dee Dee and Shayla and Candace arched their backs. Every girl curves into the weight of a body not ready to fill the slope and bust of a boy's wanting gaze. I touched my nipples. I watched my mother hunch over, scoop heavy chest into stiff cones. Then it began. My slow march through each letter. Double D, E, F, G, H, I, J. Each season I spilled into a bigger size. I wanted to bounce on beaches in kite-shaped string bathing suits. Instead, my size meant cheap satin, lace, and beige breeches. No pinks, no patterns, no matching thongs for girls over G. The hard, narrow straps cut at my shoulders and rib cage, or wires and padding pinched into my body. No praise for a titty too big for a halter top or strapless. Quilted stretch of nipple, dark areola, fatty tissue reduced to sex. So much of my body is a harvest of cells, or simply a spectacle. Oh, to be alone, groping their thickness, their color, their weight, I praise myself, undoing each hook, set loose my exquisite chest.
Wow, thanks for sharing that. Very, very unique topic. You got, yeah, fantastic. So yeah, and it got me thinking about body image, and in this day and age of Instagram, and especially I think maybe young teen women are so sensitive to body image. Is that kind of what you were trying to say a little bit there?
Somewhat, yes. I mean, I think, I grew up pre-Instagram, pre-Facebook. I was, going through a lot of these things in the 80s and 90s. And so, but I think that within women, we kind of know the whole experience of like, and the desire to be kind of like a woman and all the things that it takes. But sometimes we just don't know the actual weight of what it'll be, even though we're supposed to this kind of role in our lives eventually. But also just sizing for women is just so arbitrary. And a lot of women suffer trying to figure out where they fit in, literally, in the system. And it does take a toll. We see our bodies when like the industry is creating like this one size fits all kind of model for women.
All right. If you just joined us, Nandi Comer is with us, the Michigan State Poet Laureate. This is Poets Have Something to Say, the October show. Tell us a bit, Nandi, about your journey. Can you share with us about your journey as a poet and how you discovered your passion for writing? I understand you did grow up in Detroit. What were the beginning ways that you were influenced as a writer?
So I remember my god sister reminded me that I always kept a journal. I always wrote in what I thought of as a diary at the time. But I also used to, for some reason, I thought of my prayers as things that needed to be written down.
Mm-hmm.
So I was writing that, and then I would write the villains versions of a lot of fairy tales when I was like in elementary school. But it wasn't until I had a high school teacher invite me to like use poetry as a way of expression, like in a very intentional way, that I turned to poetry. Beforehand, it was more like writing stories. And so that teacher, she had a very interesting approach of having professional writers come in and visit with her students. And I got really inspired by what I didn't know at the time was this very vibrant poetry community that was happening in the Detroit area. But I was going to be a doctor. I was like, no, this is great. I'll keep my notebook. But I just really didn't think that poetry was something that I could like do for a living, basically. And when I was a young adult at like 25, I finally found another mentor, Vivi Francis, who had taken it upon herself to teach classes out of her home. And I didn't know what I was getting into, but after my first day with her, like my whole perspective on what I could do as a writer and where I could be as a writer changed for me.
Wow, it's amazing. What about your inspirations? Do you have particular people that inspire you? Do you have mentors?
Yeah, I mean, I have mentors. I have people that I've studied under, that I've maintained relationship with. I will mention them, but I wouldn't say that I feel inspired by their work, but I wouldn't say that I'm always like drawing from it. So I studied with Ross Gay when I was in Indiana University, and he's become a really good friend and mentor to me. And then I'll mention Vivi Francis again as someone who I almost all the time when we have conversations, I learn so much about poetry and about what kind of artists we can be in the world. So I really enjoy being around those two. But as far as reading, they're just like a stack of writers that I always return to. So Yusuf Komenyaka is one of the people that I just continuously return to. I've been recently going through all of the poems of Jim Daniels just because I love how he writes about Detroit. It's a different Detroit than what I grew up in. But it's something that because I'm starting to write Detroit poems, I've been looking at the ways that others have written about Detroit and thought, let me see what I want to do, how I can take inspiration from that.
That sounds amazing. How would you describe your writing process? Do you have a particular like rituals or habits, or how does that happen?
I tend to be this year in particular, I decided to practice a poem a day for the whole year.
Wow.
But it's I'm not necessarily writing a whole new poem. I allow myself to do revisions, and I allow myself to do things that are art making sometimes. So it allows me a little bit of space, but mostly it's poetry that I'm working on, and that tends to get me much more like honed in on the process and to not let go of what I've been thinking of. So in the morning I wake up, I usually journal. I'm reading something. I might respond to that reading if it so brings me up. So like right now I'm reading Patricia Smith. Should have been Ginny Savannah, and she's got me thinking all kinds of things about childhood and an urban city. But I always try to end the day returning back to that writing and seeing if there was something there or another idea that might occur. That's right now because I am not in a 9 to 5. I don't have children, and so that's just how my process has been right now. But in general, I always have been a morning writer too.
Awesome. So you're challenging yourself to write one poem per day?
Yeah, and listen, let me explain something. Most of them are bad poems. Most of them are just things that I have just, I just want to put up there. I know that there are writers that say, that they write 10 pages before they get to the poem. Mm-hmm. And I think that's my process, is that I might have to do 10 crappy ideas before I get to something that I really think I want to revise and turn into a poem. But I allow myself to write it, and I force myself to think that, like, every day there's something worth writing about. And that is really helpful for me, because before I would do it, I remember I would just, I'd be like, well, I'll write about that when I have time. And I was always waiting for the time to come. And that kind of practice meant that I might only, maybe start an idea maybe once a month, because I wasn't giving it priority. But with the poem a day, I tend to have really strange ideas come out, and poems that I would have never expected are coming out, because I'm like, well, what are you going to write about today? You got to do it today. And so it's been a very, I do like to have a little structure in my process, even if it's like kind of a bit of a discipline, So.
Yeah, it reminded me of a couple things. So the latest, my first poetry book that was published a couple of years ago, and I challenged myself to write 100 poems in 1 year, in the year 2021, wow. And I actually did it, but it was close. I was at 75 on November 15th or something, and so there was that pressure. But the book is called My Heart at Ease, and it's available on Amazon for anybody that wants to check that out. A quick plug for my books. So we'll get to your books here in just a moment too, before we end. But what a challenge that was. But it was a lot of fun because I did feel the urgency, like kind of have to have something here. Not all the poems are fantastic, but once in a while I felt you can kind of tell when you write a really great poem? Is there a feeling you get where, I really nailed this?
Sometimes, not all the time. Mm-hmm. I do like listening sessions with other poets of mine. We'll just be sitting there talking, and I'll say, hey, listen to this. We're not even saying like I wrote something. I'm just like, I just tickled myself with this thing that I wrote, and I'll read it to them, and they'll be like, oh, you should keep going with that. Sometimes I need that because I can't see it yet.
Right.
But when I really by myself, when I feel something, for example, the poem that we started with, Broad Abecedarians, that was something that I wasn't really moving towards an abecedarian. I was just trying to process an experience with doctors and how Black women experience the medical field. And as I was thinking about it, I was thinking about particularly Black women's relationship to breast cancer. Mm-hmm. So poem has other parts that actually go into that. And so I was like, I'm writing about our relationship to our bodies, our relationship to breath. And it became somehow so clear. Why wouldn't I use the abecedarian chart that we have to refer to every time that we say what size we are? And that's something, once I cracked that, it became like this thing that just gave me a drive to like really try to like work the line, work the images, work the metaphors so that it could fit under this conceit that I had decided on. And there are definitely times that I was like, we're going to trash this version and start over. So, it's okay. Yeah. I think that's the other thing is that I don't consider, most poets will tell you that they don't consider everything they write gold.
Right.
And so they have to, but I do think that poets are their worst critics. So I'm sure there's a poem or two in my computer that my friends think I should have pursued a little harder.
Right. But with the encouragement of friends and a good writing community, and I'm lucky enough to be leading a writing group here in North Fond du Lac called the Wordsmiths. So along with being poet laureate, I'm also president of the Wordsmiths, and that's really an opinion of most of our members too. Is you have to write. Frankly, you have to write a lot of junk to get something good, and it's okay to do the free writing, and it's okay to not have a perfect poem or perfect story all the time.
Yeah, sometimes you might have something that's in like on your shoulder. It's been sitting there, and you try to write it out.
Yep.
Doesn't work. You come back to it 6 months later, it doesn't work. And 10 years later, you're like, finally, I figured out. I had to live 10 years to get this thing off my shoulder.
Right. Yeah. Right.
So it's always a process. The one thing I think I find, no matter what process people say that they have, I find some very like communal things, and that we want to be uninterrupted at least a little bit while we're doing it, right? We want to set the tone of the space that we're doing our art, and we want to be able to like name the thing that we know it in our core. We're trying to put words to something, to an experience that hasn't been done before, and so that's also the challenge, right? And I love poets for that.
That's awesome. Yeah. So yeah, good luck with your poem a day, and who knows, you might make it into a book.
Yeah.
Tell us, speaking of books, before I forget here, tell us about you have 2 books.
Yeah, I have 2 books. The first is a chapbook. It's a shorter book. I wrote this, some of the poems, I think most of them came out in the event of Michael Brown's murder. I was a staff artist in Vermont, and it was a very tough place to be because there aren't, in this small town in the mountains of Vermont, there just weren't a lot of people who were experiencing this event in the way that I was experiencing it. So I was experiencing it online mostly. And it got me to thinking about how this experience really is kind of a moment of trauma for our American culture. And what is the result of that trauma? How do we respond to it? How do we grow? How do we internalize a lot of really ideas around racism that aren't just it's not just an issue for minorities experiencing it, but also what is the toll that it takes on our mental health as a result of it. And I mean that for all Americans. So the title American Family Syndrome is a conversation about how everyone has these things in them that I don't think that sometimes they don't know are in them as a result of racism. So the American Family Syndrome is the title of a series of poems in the book. They're invented syndromes. They do not exist, but poems where they start off where there's a medical voice describing an invented syndrome that is what I think based on things that I've seen in our society.
Mm-hmm.
And the second part is the voice of someone who is experiencing it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I paired a lot of those. The other poems in there also have to deal with like family grief and really like some of the things that we've experienced as an American family.
If you just joined us, Nandi Comer is with us, the Michigan Poet Laureate. This is Poets Have Something to Say. I'm Jeff McAndrew. Just a few minutes left. The time goes quickly.
Oh, that's so fast.
It does. Or tell us just a bit about tapping out, a little bit about that.
Sure. Tapping out is very different than American Family. It is at its face value. It is my obsession with Mexican wrestling. And there are a lot of poems about the mask and wrestlers, and there's also poems about travel. Detroit shows up in it too. But yeah, this book is a lot more playful, while also grappling with some really serious ideas.
Yeah, fascinating. And are both of those books on Amazon then? Or how do you get those?
Both of them are available on Amazon. I always encourage people to go see their local bookstore because they can always order them too. But if you are in a space where you can't reach your local bookstore, any of the online booksellers are good to reach out to.
Excellent. What's your advice to young writers, young poets?
There is always a poem for everyone. If you feel like you can't find poetry that really speaks to you, keep reading. Go to the library, randomly pick out stuff, go to reading, and start to figure out what kind of poet or what your voice will be, because there is a poem for everyone and there is an audience for every poet.
That's awesome. And do you have one more short poem you can share with us?
Sure. So I got this one poem. It's the last poem in my book, and it is. I'm only going to read the second part. It's the voice of the mask of a wrestler who has lost his mask in a match.
Okay.
And the second part is called La Máscara, which is the mask.
Mm-hmm.
Losing the mask to La Máscara. Before I let go, before they part me open, before they pull you head first out of me and hand me over to a man who will take me and hang me, before I become a sparkling medallion, a memory, a relic of slaughter, you have to loosen all the strings. You will always have hair, boots, and tape. In a year, you can go to a mall or grocery store. You can walk through the dust of a market, and everyone will know the bottom lip and callous forehead I have kept for so long. Mijo, before I let go of your face, someone will have to rip me apart.
Well, thanks for sharing that, Nandi Comer. It's been a pleasure having you on the show. Any final words as the Michigan Poet Laureate on our show?
Just to keep reading poetry. There's all kind of poems out there. Keep reading.
All right. Thank you again, Nandi Comer, our guest on the October show of Poets Have Something to Say. We'll be back with another show on November 1st. Thanks for joining us.